Shadows in the morning light. The soft hum of the morning traffic outside the bustling city square blended with the rhythmic tapping of Officer Ryan Keller's boots on the cold, tiled floor of Sutterton Department Store. The early sunlight filtered through the large glass storefront, casting geometric patterns onto the polished surfaces of the jewelry section. Ryan adjusted his utility belt, his badge glinting as he moved, scanning the aisles with practiced precision. It was a routine patrol, nothing out of the ordinary, until his eyes landed on a peculiar sight. Near the jewelry counter, a young girl stood with her back slightly hunched, her fingers deftly moving among the delicate displays. She couldn't have been older than 9 or 10, her slight frame draped in a weathered coat that seemed 2 sizes too large. Her black hair fell in straight, shiny curtains, obscuring part of her pale, gaunt face. Despite her size, there was an unnatural confidence in her posture, a deliberate steadiness that caught Ryan's attention. He lingered for a moment, watching her movements. She reached out, her fingers brushing over a sapphire-studded bracelet on its velvet display. With surprising ease, she slid the bracelet into the oversized pocket of her coat. Ryan sighed inwardly. Another kid acting out, he thought. Probably trying to prove something or just desperate for attention. Shoplifting among the youth wasn't uncommon, especially in this part of the city. "Hey there," Ryan said, his tone calm but firm as he approached. "Care to tell me what you're doing with that bracelet?" The girl froze mid-step, her head tilting slightly as though considering whether to run or respond. Slowly, she turned to face him. For a moment, Ryan's breath caught in his throat. Her eyes were the color of storm clouds, deep and unnervingly focused. There was something almost ancient in her gaze, too sharp, too calculating for a child. "Why are you stopping me?" she asked, her voice soft, but carrying an edge that sent a shiver down Ryan's spine. He crouched slightly to meet her at eye level. "Because that bracelet doesn't belong to you. Taking things without paying for them is against the law." Her expression didn't falter. She didn't fidget or look away like most kids would when caught. Instead, she studied him with a quiet intensity. "You don't understand. I needed to take it." "Needed to?" Ryan raised an eyebrow. "That's not how it works. Come on, let's talk about this at the station." As he reached for the cuffs clipped to his belt, her small hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not supposed to stop me. This isn't how it's supposed to go." Ryan felt a flicker of unease crawl up his spine, but he shook it off. "She's just a kid trying to scare me." Still, her words lingered, heavier than they should have been. "Hands behind your back," he instructed, clicking the cuffs into place around her tiny wrists. She complied without resistance, though her eyes never left his. There was something unnerving about her stillness, as though she was a porcelain doll instead of a child. As he guided her toward the store exit, the morning light poured in through the doors, illuminating her pale features. Her lips moved almost imperceptibly, and Ryan leaned in slightly to catch her words. "The shadows follow those who interfere," she murmured. "They always have. They always will." A chill spread through Ryan's chest, despite the warmth of the sun. He squared his shoulders, determined not to let her strange behavior rattle him. "Let's get you to the station, kid," he said, steering her toward his patrol car. The streets outside were bustling with morning commuters, the city's usual symphony of honking horns and distant chatter filling the air. But as Ryan drove toward the station, a peculiar silence seemed to envelop the car. He glanced in the rearview mirror. The girl sat perfectly still, her hands folded neatly in her lap despite the cuffs. Her eyes, dark and reflective, were fixed on his. "You feel it, don't you?" she said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her tone was calm, almost conversational, but it sent a jolt through Ryan. "The wrongness. It's already begun." "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice firmer than he felt. "Look, I don't know what game you're playing, but you're not going to scare me. You're just a kid who made a bad decision." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Am I?" Ryan gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles turning white. The streets outside seemed unusually quiet, the usual morning crowds conspicuously absent. He glanced around, his unease growing. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. The once busy sidewalks were barren, the storefronts eerily still. A single newspaper fluttered across the street, propelled by a wind he couldn't feel. "What the?" he muttered, his voice trailing off. "The choice you make next," the girl said, her voice soft but firm, "will echo far beyond this moment." Ryan's stomach churned as the station came into view. He didn't know what to make of her cryptic warnings, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, inexplicably wrong. Unseen shadows. The patrol car rolled to a stop outside the station, its engine humming softly in the unnatural quiet. Officer Ryan Keller gripped the steering wheel for a moment, staring at the familiar brick facade of the precinct. Normally, the sight of the station offered him a sense of routine and stability. Today, it felt off, cold, distant, and uninviting. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel in the parking lot. A light breeze brushed past, carrying a chill that didn't match the mild spring morning. He opened the back door to let the girl out, her small frame illuminated by the stark sunlight. Even in the warmth of day, her presence seemed to carry an eerie, unexplainable weight. "Let's go," Ryan said, his voice sharper than intended. He guided her inside, his hand lightly resting on her shoulder. She moved without resistance, her gait steady and calm, as though she were in control despite the cuffs around her wrists. Inside the precinct, the usual hum of activity greeted them. Phones rang, officers chatted, and the smell of stale coffee filled the air. But as Ryan escorted the girl through the main corridor, the noise seemed to fade, like sound itself recoiled from her presence. Heads turned, conversations halted, and a strange hush followed them as they walked toward the holding area. Ryan ignored the stares, though his pulse quickened. He ushered the girl into an interrogation room, its stark fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. She sat down in the chair across from him, her hands resting neatly on the cold metal table. Her stillness was unnerving, her composure too perfect. "Wait here," Ryan said, trying to mask the unease creeping into his voice. "Someone will be in to talk to you soon." The girl didn't respond, her eyes fixed on a distant point beyond him. As Ryan stepped out of the room, he felt her gaze linger on his back, a weight that followed him even after the door clicked shut. Back at his desk, Ryan stared blankly at his computer screen, trying to focus on the incident report. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but the words wouldn't come. The events of the morning replayed in his mind. The emptiness of the streets, the girl's cryptic warnings, and the strange chill that seemed to follow her. "What's her deal?" Officer Martha Jenkins asked, leaning against the edge of his desk. Her dark eyes flicked toward the interrogation room window, where the girl sat unmoving. "She's been in there for 20 minutes and hasn't said a word." "Caught her shoplifting," Ryan said, his voice flat. He rubbed the back of his neck, the tension in his shoulders growing. "She's weird, though. Creepy." Jenkins smirked, though her usual confidence seemed forced. "Weird how?" "Like she fought back. Tried to run." "No," Ryan said, shaking his head. "She just said things that didn't make sense." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Like what?" Ryan hesitated, debating whether to repeat the girl's warnings. Before he could answer, the lights in the precinct flickered. A collective murmur rippled through the room as officers glanced around, puzzled. "Must be a power surge," Jenkins muttered, though her tone lacked conviction. The lights steadied, but the air in the station felt different, heavier, almost oppressive. Ryan's stomach churned with unease as he turned back to his computer. His fingers finally began typing, but the report felt mechanical, the words hollow. Meanwhile, in the interrogation room, the girl sat perfectly still, her gaze unwavering. The air around her seemed to hum faintly, an almost imperceptible vibration that anyone nearby would dismiss as imagination. The fluorescent lights above her flickered again, their faint buzz growing louder for a moment before settling. Sergeant Pete Harris entered the room, his broad frame casting a shadow across the table. He dropped a manila folder onto the surface and pulled out a chair, the metal legs scraping against the floor. "All right, kid," he said, his gruff voice filling the silence. "You've got some explaining to do. Why'd you take the bracelet?" The girl turned her head slowly to meet his gaze. Her gray eyes were calm, but something in them made Harris falter. He shifted in his seat, his confidence wavering under her unrelenting stare. "It wasn't stealing," she said simply. Her voice was soft, almost melodic, but it carried a weight that made Harris sit up straighter. "That's not how the law works," he replied, his tone firm. "You take something that doesn't belong to you. That's theft." The girl tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "The bracelet belongs to me," she said, her voice steady. "It always has. You just don't understand." "Try me," Harris said, leaning forward. "Make me understand." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then her lips parted, and she began to speak, softly at first, but with a clarity that sent chills down Harris's spine. "It's not about the bracelet," she said. "It's about the balance. The things you take, the things you give. Everything has a cost, and some debts can't be paid with money." Harris frowned. Confusion etched across his face. "What are you talking about?" The girl's gaze bore into him, unblinking. "You'll see." Outside the room, Ryan watched through the one-way mirror, his arms crossed over his chest. The girl's words were muffled, but her demeanor spoke volumes. She wasn't scared. She wasn't defiant. She was waiting. The lights flickered again, and a sudden crash echoed through the station. Ryan and several other officers turned toward the source of the noise. A filing cabinet in the corner had tipped over, spilling papers across the floor. "What the hell?" Jenkins muttered, hurrying over to investigate. The cabinet was solid metal, too heavy to tip on its own. "Earthquake," another officer suggested, though there had been no tremor. Ryan's chest tightened as he glanced back at the interrogation room. The girl sat as still as ever, her hands folded neatly in her lap. For the briefest moment, her eyes flicked toward the mirror. Ryan's breath caught. It felt like she was looking directly at him, seeing through the glass. "Something's not right," Jenkins said, her voice hushed as she returned to Ryan's desk. "That girl, she's not normal." Ryan nodded, his unease growing by the second. "I know." He didn't say what he was thinking, didn't admit the weight of her warnings, or the way the air seemed to shift whenever she spoke. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Echoes of the unseen. The soft glow of twilight crept through the blinds of the precinct, bathing the station in an eerie orange hue. The usual hum of activity had dimmed, as if the building itself had grown wary. Officers moved about their tasks with quiet urgency, throwing glances toward the interrogation room, where the girl remained seated. The buzz of conversation that typically filled the air had been replaced by hushed murmurs. At his desk, Officer Ryan Keller sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the glowing screen of his computer. He was halfway through drafting his incident report, but the words felt hollow. His thoughts kept drifting to the girl, her unsettling calm, her cryptic warnings, and the strange energy that seemed to ripple around her. The lights flickered again. Ryan clenched his jaw as he glanced toward the ceiling. "What's with the damn lights today?" he muttered under his breath. Officer Martha Jenkins walked over, a cup of coffee in her hand. "You're not the only one noticing it," she said, leaning against the edge of his desk. "Dispatch screens are glitching too. Keep showing symbols I've never seen before, like some kind of code." Ryan frowned. "Symbols?" "Yeah," Jenkins said, her voice low. "Angular shapes, lines crossing like runes or something. It can't explain it. They're saying there's no record of errors like this in the system." Ryan's stomach tightened. He turned his head toward the interrogation room, where the girl sat unmoving. Her presence seemed to radiate through the station, touching everything in subtle, unsettling ways. In the interrogation room, Sergeant Pete Harris stared across the table at the girl, his patience wearing thin. The folder of evidence sat unopened before him, forgotten in the face of her unflinching demeanor. "Look, kid," he said, his voice rough. "You need to start giving me straight answers. What's with the bracelet? And why are you acting like this?" The girl tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged. "You're asking the wrong questions." Harris narrowed his eyes. "Oh yeah. What's the right question, then?" She leaned forward, her small hands resting lightly on the table. For the first time, her voice carried a hint of something deeper, almost otherworldly. "What happens when you interfere with something you don't understand?" Harris chuckled humorlessly, but the sound lacked confidence. "Kid, I've seen a lot in my time. You don't scare me." Her gray eyes bore into him, and the room seemed to grow colder. "You should be scared," she said softly. "Not of me, but of what comes next." Ryan watched the exchange from the observation room, a cold knot forming in his chest. He didn't know why he felt compelled to intervene, but something about the girl's demeanor made his instincts scream that they were heading into dangerous territory. Before he could act, a crash echoed through the station. Officers rushed toward the source of the noise. A metal filing cabinet had toppled over, spilling papers across the floor. Ryan froze as he noticed the scattered documents. Every page bore the same strange symbols Jenkins had described. They weren't handwritten, nor did they match any known typeface. The angular lines and intersecting shapes seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. "What is this?" Jenkins murmured, crouching to pick up one of the pages. She turned to Ryan, her face pale. "This isn't normal." Ryan stepped forward, his breath quickening. As he reached for a page, the air around them grew colder. The fluorescent lights above flickered violently, plunging the station into momentary darkness. When the lights steadied, every officer stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear. "She's doing this," someone whispered. Ryan turned toward the interrogation room. Through the one-way glass, he saw the girl staring directly at him. Her lips moved, though no sound reached his ears. The temperature in the room dropped further, and he felt an icy dread creep into his bones. Back in the interrogation room, Harris stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Enough with the riddles," he barked, slamming his hands on the table. "You're just a kid, and this is just a theft charge. Stop with the theatrics." The girl's expression didn't waver. "You don't understand what you've done." "What I've done?" Harris scoffed. "You're the one sitting here with cuffs on, not me." She blinked slowly, her voice calm but carrying an unshakable authority. "You brought me here. You locked me away. You interrupted the balance." Harris opened his mouth to retort, but a sharp pain shot through his chest. He clutched at his shirt, gasping as the sensation spread. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he stumbled backward, his knees buckling. "Harris!" Ryan burst into the room, catching the sergeant as he collapsed to the floor. Jenkins followed close behind, her eyes darting nervously between Harris and the girl. "What's happening to him?" Jenkins demanded. The girl remained still, her gaze steady. "It's starting." Ryan's heart pounded as he lowered Harris to the floor. "What's starting? What are you talking about?" "The consequences," she said simply. "You shouldn't have interfered." As Harris was carried out on a stretcher, the rest of the station seemed to unravel. Lights flickered and dimmed, phones rang with static-filled voices, and computers displayed the same cryptic symbols that had appeared on the papers. Objects began to move on their own, chairs sliding across the floor, pens rolling off desks, filing cabinets vibrating. Fear spread like wildfire among the officers. Jenkins grabbed Ryan's arm, her grip tight. "We need to figure out what's going on. This isn't normal." Ryan nodded, his gaze fixed on the girl through the observation window. She sat serenely amidst the chaos, as though the world outside the room didn't exist. "What do we do?" Jenkins asked. Ryan took a deep breath, the weight of the pendant around his neck grounding him. "We talk to her. We listen." "You can't be serious," Jenkins said, her voice rising. "She's the one causing this." "I don't think she's causing it," Ryan replied, his voice calm despite his fear. "I think she's the only one who can stop it." Ryan stepped back into the interrogation room, his movements careful, deliberate. The door clicked shut behind him, muffling the sounds of chaos outside. He took a seat across from the girl, his eyes searching hers for any hint of malice or intent. "What's happening?" he asked quietly. "What's causing this?" She regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "You broke the balance." "What balance?" "The bracelet wasn't just jewelry," she said. "It's a piece of something much older, something that keeps things in harmony. When you took it from me, you disrupted that harmony." Ryan's stomach churned. "And now what?" She tilted her head slightly, her expression softening. "Now you have a choice. Restore the balance, or let the shadows consume everything." Ryan stared at her, the weight of her words settling over him like a heavy shroud. He didn't understand the full scope of what she was saying, but he knew one thing. The station, and perhaps more, was at stake. The cost of restoration. The station's atmosphere grew heavier with each passing moment, as if the very air were laced with an invisible weight. Shadows flickered unnaturally along the walls, seeming to twist and stretch with their own intent. The usual fluorescent hum had turned into a low, rhythmic buzz, like a pulse echoing through the building. In the interrogation room, Ryan Keller sat across from the girl, his chest tightening as her calm, knowing gaze bore into him. The chaos outside felt distant now, muffled by the walls of the small room. Still, the tension pressed against him like a vice. "You said I broke the balance," Ryan began, his voice low but steady. "How do I fix it?" The girl leaned forward slightly, her small hands folded neatly on the table. For the first time, her expression softened, not with relief or sympathy, but with the kind of weight one might carry when delivering a difficult truth. "Restoring the balance is not simple," she said, her voice measured. "The bracelet was just one piece of a larger whole. Taking it disrupted an ancient order, one that existed long before you or I were here." Ryan frowned. "What kind of order? What does this have to do with you?" She hesitated, her eyes drifting to the table as though searching for the right words. "My family, we're the caretakers of this balance. For generations, we've guarded objects like the bracelet, artifacts that anchor the threads of harmony between this world and the one just beyond." Ryan felt a chill crawl down his spine. "What's beyond? Are you saying there's another dimension or something?" The girl met his gaze again, her expression unreadable. "It's not something humans can fully understand. Think of it like a shadow, a parallel existence that follows yours but is invisible until you disturb it. These artifacts keep the shadow world from spilling into this one." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, trying to absorb the enormity of what she was saying. "And now that I've disturbed it." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "The threads are fraying. The longer the balance remains broken, the more the shadows will seep through. And the more they seep, the harder they are to contain." Ryan's heart pounded. "What happens if we can't stop them?" The girl's gaze darkened. "The shadows consume everything." Outside the interrogation room, the precinct was unraveling. The lights now flickered in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, casting jagged shapes onto the walls. Objects moved on their own, papers swirling into the air, chairs scraping across the floor without anyone touching them. Officers huddled in small groups, their faces pale and their voices hushed. "Clark's down," Jenkins called out, rushing to a fallen officer. "He just collapsed." No warning. Ryan emerged from the interrogation room, his jaw tight. He saw Officer Clark lying on the floor, his face pale and clammy. A small pool of blood had formed beneath his nose. "What's happening to him?" Ryan demanded, kneeling beside Jenkins. "I don't know," she said, panic creeping into her voice. It's like his body just gave out. Ryan turned his head toward the observation window. Through the glass, he could see the girl still sitting at the table, her figure unnervingly composed amidst the chaos. Her words echoed in his mind. The shadows consume everything. Back in the interrogation room, Ryan leaned against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest. He was silent for a moment, his mind racing as he tried to piece together a solution. "You're saying the bracelet is part of something bigger," he said finally. "Where are the other pieces?" The girl looked up at him, her expression calm but resolute. "They're scattered. Some are hidden, others lost. But the bracelet is the keystone. It holds the others in alignment. Without it, the threads will continue to unravel." "Then why take it from the store?" Ryan asked, his frustration leaking into his voice. "Why put the balance at risk?" "I didn't take it for myself," she replied. "I took it because it was vulnerable. If someone else had gotten hold of it, someone who didn't understand, it could have been far worse." Ryan paced the room, his thoughts churning. "So if we return the bracelet, everything goes back to normal?" She hesitated, her small fingers fidgeting slightly. "Returning it to its place will stop the unraveling. For now. But the threads are already weakened. The restoration won't be permanent unless we do more." "What more?" Ryan asked, stopping mid-step. She looked up at him, her eyes somber. "Someone has to willingly anchor the balance. A sacrifice is needed, someone to stand as the bridge between the two worlds." Ryan's stomach dropped. "Sacrifice. It doesn't mean death," she clarified. "But it does mean giving up your connection to this world. The anchor becomes a living thread, bound to the artifacts and the balance. It's a life of isolation, vigilance, and constant sacrifice." Ryan's throat tightened. "And you were planning to do this?" She nodded. "It's my family's duty. But now, the choice might not be mine alone." As the precinct continued to descend into chaos, Ryan gathered the officers in the briefing room. Jenkins stood by his side, her expression grim as they relayed the girl's explanation to the others. "She's saying the bracelet and other artifacts are part of some ancient balance," Ryan said, struggling to find the right words. "If we don't fix this, the situation will escalate. Fast." "What do we do?" an officer asked, his voice shaking. "Return the bracelet and hope for the best." Ryan exchanged a glance with Jenkins. "Returning it is only the first step. The girl says someone has to serve as an anchor to stabilize the balance permanently." "An anchor?" Jenkins repeated. "What does that even mean?" "It means someone gives up their life here," Ryan said, his voice heavy. "They're bound to the balance, to the artifacts. It's a commitment that lasts forever." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone present. "Who's going to do that?" another officer asked, breaking the silence. Ryan didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted toward the interrogation room, where the girl still waited. The pendant around his neck felt heavier than ever, as if it carried the weight of the decision he had yet to make. Later that evening, Ryan sat alone in his car, the bracelet resting in his hand. The intricate design caught the faint glow of the streetlights, the gemstones shimmering like tiny stars. He thought about the girl, her calm resilience despite everything she carried. He thought about his colleagues, their fear and confusion. And he thought about the shadows, the unseen force threatening to consume everything. He clenched his jaw, his resolve hardening. Inside the station, Ryan returned to the interrogation room. The girl looked up as he entered, her expression unreadable. "I'll do it," he said simply. Her gray eyes widened slightly, the first crack in her stoic facade. "You don't have to." "Yes, I do," Ryan interrupted. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone. If I can stop this, if I can protect them, I will." The girl studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then we need to act quickly. The longer we wait, the harder it will be to repair the threads." As the two prepared to leave, the station trembled and the lights flickered once more. Shadows swirled along the walls, growing darker and more chaotic. Officers scrambled to maintain order, their fear palpable. Ryan took a deep breath, the bracelet clutched tightly in his hand. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he was ready to face whatever lay beyond. Into the shadows. The city was eerily quiet as Officer Ryan Keller drove through its darkened streets, the patrol car's headlights cutting through the encroaching gloom. Next to him sat the girl, her small frame rigid and her hands folded neatly in her lap. The sapphire-studded bracelet rested in the center console, its glow faint but steady, like the heartbeat of something ancient and alive. Outside, the world seemed wrong. Streetlights flickered erratically, and shadows stretched unnaturally across the pavement, twisting and contorting as though alive. Storefront windows reflected not the bustling city streets but strange, distorted versions of reality. Ryan's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as his unease grew. "Where are we going?" he asked, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. "To the place where it all began," the girl replied, her tone calm but heavy with meaning. "The veil between worlds is thinnest there. That's where the balance must be restored." Ryan swallowed hard, his throat dry. "And where exactly is that?" She turned her head toward him, her storm-gray eyes meeting his. "The old cemetery." The cemetery lay on the outskirts of the city, shrouded in mist and silence. Its wrought iron gates loomed tall and foreboding, the intricate patterns of vines and thorns seemingly alive in the pale moonlight. Ryan parked the car just outside the gates, cutting the engine but leaving the headlights on. They illuminated a narrow gravel path that disappeared into the darkness. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low. The girl nodded, stepping out of the car. "It's the only way." Ryan followed her, the bracelet clutched tightly in his hand. The pendant around his neck felt heavier with each step, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold night air. As they passed through the gates, a deep chill settled over him, the kind that seeped into his bones and made him shiver despite his jacket. The cemetery was vast, its weathered tombstones standing like sentinels in the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath their feet. Shadows danced across the ground, their movements unnatural and disjointed. "Stay close," the girl said, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan didn't need to be told twice. He kept her within arm's reach as they made their way deeper into the cemetery, the path twisting and turning as though leading them somewhere specific. The further they walked, the more the air seemed to hum with an unseen energy, a low, vibrating thrum that resonated in his chest. Finally, they reached a small clearing at the heart of the cemetery. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, its surface etched with strange symbols that seemed to shift and shimmer in the moonlight. The air here was thick, almost suffocating, and the shadows pressed in closer, swirling around the edges of the clearing like predators circling their prey. "This is the place," the girl said, stepping forward. She turned to Ryan, her expression solemn. "The veil is weakest here. This is where we restore the balance." Ryan stared at the altar, his chest tightening. "And how do we do that?" She held out her hand. The bracelet. He hesitated for a moment before placing it in her palm. As soon as it left his hand, the air around them seemed to shift. The shadows recoiled slightly, and the hum grew louder, almost like a heartbeat. The girl approached the altar, her movements deliberate. She placed the bracelet on the stone, aligning it with the symbols etched into the surface. Then she turned back to Ryan. "Now comes the hard part." The ground beneath their feet trembled as the girl began to chant in that strange, ancient language. Her voice was soft, but carried an immense weight, the words reverberating through the clearing. The symbols on the altar began to glow, their light pulsating in rhythm with the hum in the air. Ryan watched in awe as the bracelet lifted slightly off the stone, suspended by an invisible force. The shadows around them grew more agitated, their movements frantic and erratic. They surged toward the altar, only to be pushed back by the glowing symbols. "What's happening?" Ryan asked, his voice tight with tension. "They don't want us to succeed," the girl said, her voice strained. "They feed on imbalance, on chaos. Restoring the balance weakens them." The shadows pressed closer, their forms coalescing into humanoid shapes with elongated limbs and featureless faces. Ryan's breath quickened as he realized they were no longer just flickering images, but physical entities, their presence cold and oppressive. "What do we do?" he asked, his hand instinctively reaching for the pendant around his neck. "You need to become the anchor," the girl said, her chanting momentarily pausing. "Stand at the altar and place your hand on the bracelet." Ryan hesitated, his heart pounding. "What happens to me?" "You'll be bound to the balance," she said, her eyes meeting his. "You'll feel its weight, its pull, but you'll also have the strength to keep it in place." The shadows surged forward, their movements frantic. Ryan took a deep breath, steeling himself. "If it means stopping this, then I'll do it." He stepped forward, his hand trembling as he reached for the bracelet. As soon as his fingers touched it, a searing warmth shot through his body, spreading from his hand to his chest. The pendant around his neck grew hot, its glow matching the light of the symbols on the altar. The girl resumed her chanting, her voice rising in intensity. The shadows screamed, an unearthly, piercing sound that echoed through the clearing. They writhed and twisted, their forms dissolving into tendrils of darkness that were drawn toward the bracelet. Ryan clenched his teeth as the warmth turned to fire, his entire body consumed by the energy of the balance. He felt it, threads of light and shadow intertwining, pulling and pushing against each other. The weight of it pressed down on him, but he stood firm, his resolve unshaken. The ritual reached its crescendo, the girls chanting blending with the hum of the air and the glowing symbols. The shadows were pulled into the bracelet, their forms collapsing into nothingness. The light grew brighter and brighter until it was blinding, forcing Ryan to close his eyes. And then, silence. When he opened his eyes, the clearing was still. The shadows were gone, the air calm and quiet. The bracelet lay on the altar, its glow faint but steady. Ryan's body ached, but he felt an unfamiliar sense of peace, as though a great weight had been lifted, not just from the world, but from within him. The girl approached him, her expression unreadable. "It's done," she said softly. "You're the anchor now." Ryan looked down at his hands. They were steady, but he could feel the connection, the threads of the balance coursing through him, tying him to something far greater than himself. "What happens now?" he asked. She gave him a small, sad smile. "Now you protect the balance. Always." The watcher's burden. The clearing was still, yet the silence felt alive, pulsing with the quiet energy that now flowed through Ryan Keller. He stood by the ancient stone altar, his hand still lingering near the faintly glowing bracelet. The girl stood a few feet away, watching him with an expression that seemed both grateful and sorrowful. The ritual had ended, and the shadows had been banished. But Ryan knew instinctively that this was only the beginning. As they made their way back to the car, the weight of his new reality began to settle over him. The world around them seemed brighter, clearer, and yet alien. The subtle threads of the balance Ryan now anchored were visible to him, lines of energy crisscrossing the landscape, shimmering faintly in the air like gossamer strands. Each thread felt alive, humming with an ancient rhythm he didn't yet understand. The girl walked in silence beside him, her small figure dwarfed by the night. When they reached the car, she hesitated, turning to face him. "You'll feel it now," she said, her voice quiet. "Every shift, every ripple in the balance. It's part of you." Ryan nodded, though the enormity of her words made his chest tighten. "And if something happens? If it starts to fray again?" "You'll know," she replied. "And you'll know what to do." Her eyes met his, and for a moment he saw the weight she carried, the centuries of her family's burden passed down to her. Though she was just a child, her gaze held the wisdom of someone who had lived many lifetimes. "Will I ever be able to stop?" he asked hesitantly. The girl shook her head. The balance doesn't stop. It's constant. And now, so are you. Her words hung in the air, heavy with finality. Without another word, she climbed into the car, leaving Ryan to process the reality of his new role. The drive back to the city was quiet, the streets eerily empty. Ryan felt the threads of the balance tugging at his awareness, subtle vibrations that seemed to connect everything around him. The sensation was overwhelming, yet oddly comforting, a reminder that his sacrifice hadn't been in vain. As they approached the precinct, the girl broke the silence. "This will be the last time I see you." Ryan glanced at her, his brows furrowing. "Why? Where will you go?" "My family has to move again," she said simply. "We always do. It's how we stay safe." The pang of loss hit him harder than he expected. Despite the briefness of their connection, the girl had become a symbol of something greater, a guide who had helped him find his place in this strange new reality. "I'll make sure no one follows you," Ryan said firmly. "I'll keep you and your family safe." The girl offered him a faint smile. "You already have." Back at the precinct, the aftermath of the Shadow's invasion was still evident. Papers littered the floor, desks were overturned, and the air carried the lingering chill of fear. Officers moved about cautiously, their eyes darting toward every flickering light or creaking sound. Jenkins approached as Ryan stepped inside, her face pale but resolute. "What happened out there?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ryan hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing against his tongue. But he couldn't tell her. Not all of it. The balance, the shadows, the role he now played. It was too much for anyone to understand. "Everything's under control now," he said instead, his voice steady. "But I need to write a report. Alone." Jenkins frowned but nodded, stepping aside as Ryan made his way to his desk. The pendant around his neck felt warm, its steady pulse a reminder of the connection he now shared with the balance. As he sat down, the girl approached him one final time. "There's something I want to give you," she said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a small notebook bound in worn leather. "This belonged to my mother. It has everything you'll need to understand the balance." Ryan accepted it carefully, his fingers brushing against the aged cover. "Thank you." The girl hesitated, then stepped back. "Goodbye, Officer Keller." Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows outside the station. Ryan sat there for a long moment, the notebook heavy in his hands. In the days that followed, life at the precinct slowly returned to normal. The officers chalked up the strange events to stress, electrical malfunctions, and overactive imaginations. Only Ryan knew the truth, but he carried it silently. At night, when the city was quiet, he would open the notebook and read its pages by the dim light of his desk lamp. The text was written in a mix of languages, some he recognized, others he didn't. But as he read, the meaning came to him, not in words, but in sensations and impressions. The notebook revealed the intricate workings of the balance, the ways it could be protected, and the dangers that threatened it. Ryan found himself growing more attuned to the threads of the balance. He could sense disturbances, a flicker of tension in the air, a faint vibration beneath his feet. At first, it was disorienting, but over time, he learned to trust his instincts. One night, he felt the first true ripple. The disturbance came as a faint pull, like a thread tugged too tightly. Ryan followed the sensation to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside, he found a group of people gathered around an old, rusted artifact, a chalice engraved with the same shifting symbols as the bracelet. "They're trying to use it," he realized, his chest tightening. The artifact pulsed with unstable energy, its glow erratic. Ryan stepped forward, his voice steady. "You need to stop." The group turned to face him, their expressions defiant. "You don't understand," one of them said. "This can give us power." "No," Ryan replied, his hand brushing the pendant at his neck. "It'll destroy you and everything around you." The tension in the room was palpable, but Ryan stood his ground. Slowly, the group backed away, their expressions turning from defiance to fear as the artifact's glow intensified. Ryan approached it carefully, his hand outstretched. As soon as he touched it, the energy stabilized. The threads of the balance pulsed through him, guiding his movements. He lifted the chalice and felt its power settle, the disturbance fading into nothingness. Ryan returned to his car, the chalice safely tucked into the passenger seat. He felt the weight of his new role more acutely than ever, but there was also a quiet satisfaction in knowing he had succeeded. The balance was his burden now, but it was also his purpose. As he drove back into the city, the pendant around his neck glowed faintly, a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. Epilogue. Months later, Ryan stood at the edge of the same cemetery where it had all begun. The air was crisp, and the world felt calm. He had become a silent guardian of the balance, moving through the city unnoticed, but always vigilant. He touched the pendant at his neck and closed his eyes, feeling the steady hum of the threads. Somewhere out there, the girl and her family were safe, continuing their own quiet vigil. Ryan smiled faintly, knowing he was no longer alone in his duty. The balance held. For now, and he would ensure it stayed that way. Guardians in the shadows. The air in the cemetery was cool and crisp as Officer Ryan Keller stood before the ancient stone altar, the memory of that fateful night still vivid in his mind. The weight of the pendant around his neck had become a constant presence, its steady hum a reminder of his new role. Weeks had passed since the ritual that bound him to the balance, but the echoes of that moment still resonated within him. Ryan had grown used to the whispers of the balance, the subtle pull of its threads guiding him to disturbances he couldn't fully explain. Each thread was unique, carrying its own frequency, its own rhythm. To anyone else, the world remained the same, a collection of sights and sounds. But to Ryan, it was a tapestry of energy, fragile and beautiful. Tonight, though, the threads felt different, tighter, frayed. Something was coming, and it wasn't subtle. The disturbance first appeared as a flicker in the distance, a ripple in the tapestry that drew Ryan to the edge of the city. The abandoned industrial district loomed ahead, its empty warehouses casting long shadows under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. He parked his car and stepped out, the pendant pulsing softly against his chest. Ryan moved cautiously through the district, the soles of his boots crunching against the gravel. The air was thick with tension, and the hum of the balance grew louder with each step. He reached an old warehouse, its rusted doors slightly ajar. A faint glow emanated from within, pulsating like a heartbeat. Inside, the scene was eerily familiar. A group of figures stood in a loose circle around an object, a weathered ornate box covered in symbols that shimmered faintly in the dim light. The figures were cloaked, their faces obscured, but Ryan could feel their intent like a sharp edge against his awareness. "You shouldn't be here," Ryan said, his voice cutting through the stillness. The figures turned toward him, their movements slow and deliberate. One of them stepped forward, pulling back their hood to reveal a man with piercing blue eyes and a sharp, angular face. "This isn't your concern," the man said, his voice calm but laced with warning. "We're reclaiming what's ours." Ryan stepped closer, his hand brushing against the pendant. "That artifact isn't just a trinket. It's tied to the balance. If you disturb it, you'll unleash something none of us can control." The man's expression hardened. "You think you understand the balance. You think you're its protector. The artifacts were ours long before you came along." Ryan felt the threads tighten, the energy in the room growing volatile. "Then you should know better than to tamper with it." The man smirked. "You've only just begun to scratch the surface, Officer Keller. There's a reason these artifacts were scattered. Together, they hold a power beyond comprehension, a power that can reshape the world." "And destroy it," Ryan countered, his voice firm. "The balance isn't about power. It's about preservation." The man's smirk faded, replaced by cold resolve. "You're out of your depth." Before Ryan could respond, the box began to glow brighter, its cymbals pulsing erratically. The air grew heavier, and the hum of the balance turned into a roar. The cloaked figures stepped back, their confidence faltering as the artifact's energy spiraled out of control. Ryan moved quickly, his instincts guiding him. He reached for the box, but the energy pushed back, sending him stumbling. The pendant around his neck flared, its warmth grounding him. Gritting his teeth, he pushed forward, his hand finally closing around the artifact. The moment his fingers touched the surface, the world shifted. Ryan found himself standing in a vast expanse of darkness, the threads of the balance stretching out around him like a luminous web. The artifact hovered before him, its glow steady and calm. But beyond the threads, the shadows loomed. Hungry, formless entities that pulsed with malevolent intent. "You can't contain this forever," a voice whispered, low and insidious. "The balance will break. And when it does, we will consume everything." Ryan clenched his fists, the warmth of the pendant steadying him. "Not while I'm here." The shadows surged forward, testing the boundaries of the threads. Ryan felt the pull, the strain, but he stood firm. He reached out, his hand brushing against the artifact. Its energy responded, flowing through him like fire and light. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The balance steadied, its threads glowing brighter as the artifact's power aligned with his own. Ryan exhaled, the tension in his chest easing. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the warehouse. The artifact lay dormant in his hands, its glow extinguished. The cloaked figures were gone, their retreat marked by the faint sound of footsteps fading into the night. Ryan stared at the box, its weight more symbolic than physical. He had saved the balance, but he knew this was only one battle in a much larger war. Back at the precinct, Ryan sat at his desk, the artifact securely stored in a reinforced case. The pendant around his neck hummed faintly, its warmth a constant reminder of his duty. He opened the worn leather notebook the girl had given him, its pages filled with cryptic symbols and fragmented translations. He found a new entry he hadn't noticed before, written in neat handwriting that seemed to appear out of nowhere. "The threads are never still. The shadows are never gone. Be vigilant, watcher, for the balance is fragile, and its guardians must be steadfast." Ryan closed the notebook, his resolve hardening. The city slept, oblivious to the forces at play, but Ryan knew his work was far from over. He wasn't just a protector of the balance now. He was its guardian, its anchor, its constant. The shadows would return. The artifacts would call out again, and Ryan would be there, ready to stand between the worlds, to ensure the threads held fast. The burden was his. The balance was his, and he would not falter. The gathering storm. The days that followed Ryan Keller's confrontation in the warehouse were deceptively quiet. The threads of the balance hummed softly in the background of his awareness, their vibrations steady and calm. It was the kind of calm that felt uneasy, like the ocean before a storm. Ryan had taken to carrying the notebook with him everywhere, its cryptic passages and shifting symbols becoming his primary guide. Each time he opened it, new information seemed to surface, as though the book itself responded to his growing connection with the balance. What unnerved him was the sense of urgency in its latest passages, warning of a convergence, a moment when the threads would strain under the weight of something far greater than anything he had faced before. It began subtly. Ryan was patrolling a quiet residential neighborhood one evening when he felt it, a faint tremor in the balance. He slowed his patrol car, scanning the rows of houses bathed in the golden glow of porch lights. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the threads vibrated with an unease he couldn't ignore. He parked at the curb and stepped out, the pendant beneath his shirt growing warmer. The sensation guided him toward a small park nestled between the houses. As he approached, the air grew colder, and the faint sound of whispers reached his ears. The park was empty, save for a single figure standing near a swing set. It was a child, no older than 8, with tousled brown hair and a pale complexion. She wore a simple white dress that seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight. Her back was to Ryan, but as he drew closer, she turned her head slightly. "You're the Watcher," she said, her voice carrying an echo that made the hairs on Ryan's neck stand on end. Ryan stopped a few feet away, his hand instinctively brushing the pendant. "Who are you?" The girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "I was sent to warn you. It's coming." "What's coming?" Ryan asked, his voice steady despite the growing tension in his chest. "The convergence," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact. "The threads are fraying faster than you realize, and there are others who want to take control of them." Ryan's stomach tightened. "Who sent you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed toward the horizon, where dark clouds had begun to gather unnaturally fast. Lightning flickered within them, casting eerie shadows across the neighborhood. "The storm will test you," the girl said, her voice growing softer. "And the balance." Before Ryan could respond, the girl dissolved into a swirl of light, her form scattering into the threads of the balance. The vibrations grew louder, more chaotic, and Ryan felt a sharp tug in his chest. He ran back to his car, his mind racing. The threads were pulling him toward something far more dangerous than anything he'd encountered before. Ryan followed the pull to the outskirts of the city, where an old church stood in ruins. Its once proud spire was now a jagged silhouette against the stormy sky, and the air around it buzzed with an energy that set Ryan's teeth on edge. He parked the car and approached cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. The doors of the church creaked open as he pushed them, revealing an interior consumed by shadow. The faint glow of the pendant illuminated his path, casting long, flickering shadows on the crumbling walls. At the center of the nave stood a group of figures, their faces obscured by dark hoods. In their midst was another artifact, a circular mirror framed in ornate silver, its surface swirling with faint light. The threads of the balance converged around it, their vibrations sharp and erratic. One of the figures turned as Ryan stepped forward. It was the same man from the warehouse, his piercing blue eyes narrowing in recognition. "You again," the man said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Haven't you learned to stay out of things you don't understand?" Ryan's jaw tightened. "I understand enough to know you're playing with forces you can't control." The man chuckled, stepping closer to the mirror. "Control? We're not trying to control anything. We're trying to release it." Ryan's pulse quickened. "Release what?" The man gestured to the swirling surface of the mirror. "The truth. The power that lies beyond the veil. The balance isn't natural. It's a cage, and we're going to break it." The air around them grew heavier, the threads of the balance straining under the pressure. Ryan could feel the chaos seeping through the mirror, the shadows it unleashed twisting and writhing at the edges of the room. "You have no idea what you're doing," Ryan said, his voice rising. "If the balance breaks, it won't just be this world that suffers, it'll be all worlds." The man smirked. "Then you better stop us, Watcher." The figures moved as one, their hands raising in unison as they began to chant. The mirror's glow intensified, its surface rippling like water as shadows spilled forth. Ryan felt the pendant burn against his chest, its warmth a grounding force amidst the chaos. He stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the mirror. The energy pushed back, but Ryan gritted his teeth, focusing on the threads of the balance. He could feel them straining, their harmony unraveling as the mirror's power grew. "You can't stop it," the man shouted, his voice distorted by the energy coursing through the room. "The veil will fall." Ryan ignored him, his focus entirely on the threads. He reached deeper, pulling on the connections that bound the balance together. The pendant flared, its light blinding as it channeled his will. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. The mirror cracked, its surface fracturing under the strain. The figures recoiled, their chants faltering as the balance reasserted itself. With a final surge of light, the mirror shattered, its shards disintegrating into nothingness. The threads of the balance steadied, their vibrations returning to a calm hum. Ryan stood in the center of the nave, his chest heaving. The figures had vanished, their departure marked only by the faint echo of footsteps. The church was silent once more, its air clear of the oppressive energy that had consumed it. Back at the precinct, Ryan sat alone in his office, the weight of the night pressing down on him. The notebook lay open before him, its pages filled with new passages that seemed to have written themselves. The convergence has begun. The threads will tighten, and the guardians must hold fast. Trust the balance. Trust yourself. Ryan closed the notebook, his resolve hardening. The battle was far from over, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The balance was his to protect, and he would not let it fall. Threads of fire. The precinct was unusually quiet the morning after the shattered mirror incident in the abandoned church. Ryan Keller sat at his desk, the weight of the previous night still pressing against him like an unseen force. The threads of the balance hummed in the background of his awareness, steady but strained, as if holding their breath. He flipped open the leather-bound notebook, the pages now familiar yet still brimming with mysteries. A new entry had appeared, written in bold, looping script. When the threads are tested by fire, the anchor must endure. Beware the ones who burn the web. They'd wield the flames of ruin. Prepare. Ryan's fingers lingered on the words. He didn't know who, or what, was writing in the notebook, but he'd come to trust it as his guide. Still, the warning sent a shiver down his spine. Flames of ruin. What did that even mean? Before he could dwell on it, Officer Martha Jenkins approached, her face pale and drawn. "Ryan," she said, her voice low. "You need to see this." The crime scene was unlike anything Ryan had ever encountered. A block of abandoned warehouses in the city's industrial district was engulfed in an unnatural fire. The flames didn't spread like normal fire. Instead, they danced and twisted in strange, erratic patterns, their colors shifting from orange to blue to an eerie green. The air was thick with acrid smoke that carried an almost metallic tang, and the threads of the balance trembled violently, as though crying out in pain. "What the hell is this?" Jenkins murmured, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. Ryan's chest tightened. He could feel the heat of the flames from where he stood, yet the pendant around his neck remained cool, its steady hum a stark contrast to the chaos. This wasn't just a fire, it was something much worse. He stepped closer, ignoring the shouts of firefighters struggling to contain the blaze. The threads were pulling him toward the epicenter, their vibrations urgent and insistent. "Stay here," he told Jenkins, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Ryan, wait," she began, but he was already moving. The heart of the fire was a gutted warehouse, its steel beams warped and blackened. As Ryan approached, the flames seemed to recoil slightly, their movements erratic and almost hesitant. The threads vibrated more intensely, guiding him toward a cluster of shadowy figures standing amidst the inferno. It was them, the cloaked figures from the church. They stood in a loose circle, their hands raised toward a glowing artifact suspended in the air above them. The object was a jagged, crystalline shard, its surface pulsating with fiery light. The flames seemed to emanate from it, feeding off its energy. Ryan's voice cut through the roar of the fire. "Stop." The figures turned, their faces obscured by their hoods. The man with piercing blue eyes stepped forward, his expression cold and defiant. "You again," he said, his voice carrying over the chaos. "Still trying to play the hero. You're tearing the balance apart." Ryan shot back, his hand gripping the pendant beneath his shirt. "Whatever you think you're doing, it's not worth the cost." The man smirked. "The cost? You don't even understand the stakes. This shard is a key, one of many. Together, they can unlock the true potential of the balance." Ryan took another step forward, the pendant glowing faintly against his chest. "The balance isn't meant to be unlocked. It's meant to hold the world together. You break it, You destroy everything. The man's smirk faded, replaced by a scowl. You think we're destroying the world? No. We're remaking it, and you're standing in the way. With a sharp gesture, he raised his hand. The shard above him flared, its light intensifying. The flames surged, roaring toward Ryan like a tidal wave. Ryan reacted instinctively, his hand gripping the pendant as he reached out to the threads. The balance responded, its energy flowing through him in a surge of warmth and light. The flames parted, deflecting harmlessly around him as the pendant pulsed against his chest. The man's eyes narrowed. Impressive. But you can't hold it forever. Ryan didn't reply. Instead, he focused on the threads, weaving them together in his mind. The shard was the source of the disturbance, its energy destabilizing the balance. He had to stop it, no matter the cost. He stepped forward, his movements deliberate. The flames lashed out again, but the threads shielded him, their harmony resonating in his chest. The figures backed away, their confidence faltering as Ryan closed the distance. The man raised his hand again, his voice rising in a harsh chant. The shard's light grew blinding, its energy crackling through the air. Ryan could feel the threads fraying, their vibrations sharp and discordant. You're too late, the man shouted, his voice echoing with unnatural power. The fire will consume everything, and the balance will be ours to control. Ryan's jaw tightened. Not if I can help it. He lunged forward, his hand outstretched. The moment his fingers closed around the shard, a searing pain shot through his arm, and the world around him dissolved into a torrent of light and fire. He was no longer in the warehouse. He was in the space between worlds, the place where the threads of the balance converged. The shard burned in his hand, its energy wild and untamed. The threads around him trembled violently, their harmony shattered by the artifact's presence. Ryan gritted his teeth, his grip tightening as he reached out to the threads with his mind. Balance, he whispered, his voice steady despite the chaos. Harmony. The threads responded, their vibrations slowly steadying. The shard's energy began to shift, its wild light dimming as Ryan guided it into alignment with the balance. The pain in his arm subsided, replaced by a deep, resonant warmth. The shadows that had lingered at the edges of the threads recoiled, their forms dissolving into nothingness. The shard pulsed one final time before falling silent, its energy contained. When Ryan opened his eyes, he was back in the warehouse. The flames had vanished, leaving only smoldering embers and scorched metal. The cloaked figures were gone, their retreat marked by the faint echo of footsteps. Ryan stood alone, the shard still in his hand. It was cool now, its surface dark and unassuming. The pendant around his neck glowed faintly, its hum a soothing presence. Jenkins appeared at the entrance, her face a mixture of relief and confusion. Ryan? What the hell just happened? He took a deep breath, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. It's over. For now. Later that night, Ryan sat in his office, the shard locked securely in a reinforced case. The notebook lay open before him, its pages filled with new entries that seemed to pulse with urgency. The fire was but a spark. The ones who burn are still out there, and their flames will rise again. The watcher must be vigilant, for the storm is far from over. Ryan closed the notebook, his resolve hardening. The balance was safe, but the battle was far from finished. The ones who burned the web were still out there, and he would have to face them again. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of quiet. The threads of the balance hummed softly around him, their harmony restored, but he knew it wouldn't last. The storm was coming, and he would be ready.